The rain had started before dawn, not hard enough to flood the yard, just steady enough to darken the gravel and turn every footprint into a temporary mark. Inside Mason Industrial Repair, the sound of water drumming against the corrugated steel roof blended with the clatter of impact wrenches and the hiss of compressed air. The building smelled of diesel fuel, hot steel, and machine oil, the scent of work that never completely washed away. Near the center bay sat a 12-cylinder industrial generator engine, its green paint faded and scratched from decades of service. It supplied emergency power to a pumping station that kept irrigation water flowing to several farming communities. For nearly 2 weeks, the engine had defeated every technician in the shop. Diagnostic laptops had been connected and disconnected so many times that charging cables tangled across the concrete floor like vines. Error logs had been printed, highlighted, argued over, and pinned to a corkboard. Every sensor tested within specification. Fuel pressure was correct. Timing appeared perfect. Yet after running for less than an hour under load, the engine developed a violent vibration before shutting itself down. Replacing it wasn't an option. Manufacturing a new unit would take months, and the pumping station couldn't wait that long. "We're running out of ideas," muttered Tyler, wiping grease across an already stained rag. At 26, he was one of the youngest mechanics in the shop, and among the quickest with computer diagnostics. "I've checked every fault code twice." His supervisor, Elena Morales, leaned over the open engine compartment. She wasn't much older than Tyler, but years of managing impossible repair schedules had given her the habit of studying problems quietly before speaking. "Run the thermal scan again," she said, this time after 40 minutes, not 30. Tyler sighed, but nodded. Before he reached the laptop, the front office bell rang. No one paid attention. People came and went all day. Deliveries, customers, sales representatives. Most never stepped into the workshop itself. A minute later, footsteps echoed slowly across the concrete. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. An older man stopped near the entrance to the main repair bay, carrying a rectangular steel toolbox in one hand. The box wasn't polished or restored. Its blue paint had almost disappeared beneath layers of scratches. Corners were rounded from decades of use. Small dents covered every surface. Someone had repaired the handle years ago with a carefully bent strip of steel instead of replacing it. The toolbox looked heavy. The man carrying it looked heavier. Walter Hale paused, letting his eyes adjust to the workshop lights. His gray work jacket had been patched at both elbows. Rainwater still clung to his shoulders. Deep lines framed his face, not the kind left by age alone, but by years spent outdoors in cold mornings, engine heat, and long drives between broken machines that couldn't wait until tomorrow. He removed his cap. "Morning." The receptionist hurried over from the office. "Can I help you?" Walter nodded politely. "I heard you might need an extra pair of hands." She looked uncertain. "We're not really hiring." "I know. I only need temporary work." She hesitated before glancing toward Elena. The supervisor walked over, wiping her hands with a shop towel. "You've worked on industrial engines?" Walter smiled faintly. "A few." It wasn't arrogance. It sounded almost apologetic. Elena studied him. There was something familiar about the toolbox, not because she'd seen that particular one before, but because her grandfather had owned one almost exactly like it. Steel, heavy, built to survive decades instead of fashion. "What experience do you have?" she asked. Walter answered simply, "Field service." "For how long?" "A while." Tyler exchanged an amused glance with another technician. "A while?" Walter shrugged, as stopped counting. The younger mechanic smiled politely, not cruelly, just enough to suggest they'd already reached a conclusion. Elena noticed it. She also noticed Walter pretending not to. "So," Tyler asked, unable to resist, "what's in the museum piece?" Walter looked down at his toolbox. "My tools." Tyler grinned. "I figured." Walter smiled back, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Still useful." Another mechanic laughed softly. "Depends what century you're fixing." Nobody intended real harm. It was workplace humor, the kind that drifted through repair shops every day. Still, Walter's fingers rested briefly on the toolbox handle before he set it gently on the floor. The metal touched the concrete with a dull, familiar sound. Not loud, just solid. Elena cleared her throat. "We're trying to diagnose that generator." Walter turned toward the machine. He didn't walk directly to it. Instead, he stopped several feet away and simply watched. For nearly a full minute. No one understood why. He wasn't looking at the engine itself. His eyes moved across the floor, the mounting frame, the exhaust piping, the ventilation fans, the ceiling supports. He listened more than he looked. The generator idled in test mode. Its deep rhythm echoed through the building. Thump, thump, thump. Walter tilted his head slightly, then another few degrees, almost as though comparing sounds. Finally he spoke. When does it start? Tyler frowned. What starts? The vibration. Usually around 45 minutes. Walter nodded once. Only under load? Yes. Cold engine? No. Warm. Walter said nothing else. Instead, he crouched near one mounting bracket without touching it. His fingertips hovered a few inches above the steel. You've cleaned recently. Elena blinked. How do you know? Walter pointed toward a corner of the engine cradle. Fresh solvent. She looked. He was right. The stain was nearly invisible. Tyler crossed his arms. Lucky guess. Walter didn't answer. He simply continued observing. Not inspecting. Observing. As if he were allowing the machine to introduce itself before asking questions. An hour later, Elena found him sitting quietly on an overturned bucket near the back wall. He hadn't offered advice, hadn't criticized anyone, hadn't even opened his toolbox. You've been awfully patient, she said. Walter looked toward the engine. It hasn't told me enough yet. She smiled politely, unsure whether he was joking. You talk about machines like people. No. He looked thoughtful. A faint smile crossed Elena's face. Machines don't? They complain. She laughed despite herself. For the first time that morning, the tension inside the workshop eased. As the afternoon wore on, Tyler initiated another diagnostic run. Sensors streamed data across the laptop screen. Temperatures climbed gradually. Oil pressure remained stable. Fuel delivery stayed within acceptable limits. Everything appeared normal, until 46 minutes. The vibration returned. Low at first, then stronger. Bolts rattled. Metal shivered. The engine shut itself down before anyone reached the controls. Silence settled over the workshop. Not dramatic, just disappointing. Tyler rubbed his forehead. I don't get it. Neither did anyone else. Walter walked slowly toward the now silent engine. He still didn't touch it. Instead, he knelt beside the concrete floor. Between two support legs lay a tiny crescent of metallic dust. Most people would have mistaken it for ordinary workshop debris. Walter picked up a single grain between his fingers. He rolled it gently, then slipped it into his pocket without comment. Elena noticed. So? She asked. Walter looked at the silent generator. I'm not ready. Ready for what? To guess. That answer stayed with her long after everyone began cleaning up for the evening. As the last mechanics clocked out, Walter finally lifted the lid of his battered toolbox. Inside wasn't a collection of unusual equipment. There were ordinary spanners polished smooth by decades of use, homemade measuring gauges, carefully wrapped replacement parts, a brass feeler gauge so worn the numbers had almost disappeared, and beneath them, several cloth-bound notebooks, their pages darkened by grease and fingerprints accumulated over a lifetime. Walter rested his hand on the top notebook for a moment before closing the lid again. Across the workshop, Elena had watched the entire moment without him noticing. When Walter left for the evening, the image stayed with her, not the old tools, but those notebooks. Something told her the real value inside that toolbox had never been made of steel. If you'd like, I can continue with Chapter 2 in the same cinematic film-like style. The workshop felt different the next morning, not quieter. The same impact guns barked across the bays, forklifts beeped in reverse, and the overhead crane groaned as it lifted a transmission housing onto a steel stand. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of the shop, a quiet curiosity had settled in. Walter Hale was already there. He wasn't working on the generator. He was sweeping rainwater away from the entrance with a worn push broom. No one had asked him to. He simply noticed the puddles and got to work. Tyler carried 2 coffees into the shop and caught sight of the old mechanic. You don't have to do that, he called. Walter looked up with a small smile. I know. Walter leaned on the broom for a moment. Slippery floors make bad mornings. Tyler didn't have an answer. He handed Walter one of the coffees instead. The older man accepted it with a grateful nod, but didn't say much more. That, Tyler realized, seemed to be Walter's way. He never tried to fill silence just because it was there. By 8 o'clock, the generator sat ready for another test. Elena gathered the team around. We've got one more full day before the pumping station starts looking for alternatives. Someone muttered, there aren't any. She knew. Everyone knew. Replacing the unit wasn't realistic. The repair had to happen here. Walter stood a few steps behind the group, not part of the meeting, not exactly outside it either. When Elena finished outlining the day's plan, Walter cleared his throat. I have one request. Every head turned. I'd like the engine left alone. Tyler frowned. What do you mean? No laptops. A puzzled silence followed. No thermal cameras. Still silence. No adjustments. Elena folded her arms. Then what exactly are we supposed to do? Walter looked toward the generator. Listen. Tyler couldn't help smiling. You really think listening fixes engines? Walter met his eyes without irritation. No, it helps you stop fixing the wrong thing. An hour later, the generator was running again. No diagnostic cables hung from its sensors. No computer screens glowed beside it. Instead, Walter slowly walked around the machine. Once, then again, then a third time. Each lap was different. Sometimes he watched the exhaust, sometimes the engine mounts, sometimes the cooling lines. At one point, he simply stood with his eyes closed. Tyler whispered to another technician, "What's he doing?" Elena answered quietly before anyone else could, paying attention. She surprised herself by saying it, because somehow it seemed true. 20 minutes passed. Nothing happened. The engine settled into its familiar rhythm, deep, steady, confident. Walter pulled a long screwdriver from his toolbox. Its handle had been polished smooth by decades of use. He pressed the metal shaft gently against different parts of the engine block. The handle rested lightly against the bone just in front of his ear. Tyler watched with obvious skepticism. You can actually hear something through that? Walter nodded once. Sometimes. What? Things that haven't become noises yet. Tyler blinked. I don't understand. You will. 35 minutes into the test. Walter crouched beside the steel frame supporting the generator. He placed his fingertips against one mounting plate. Not firmly, just enough to feel. His expression didn't change. He moved to another corner. Then another. Finally he stood. Elena. She walked over. What is it? Come here. He didn't point. Instead, he guided her hand onto one section of the frame. Close your eyes. She looked confused. Seriously? He nodded. She humored him. For several seconds. Nothing. Then, a faint pulse. Not from the engine, from beneath it. Tiny. Almost impossible to notice. Like someone tapping gently on a distant pipe. She opened her eyes. I felt that. Walter nodded. So did I. Tyler walked over. What am I missing? Walter stepped aside. You tell me. Tyler placed his hand where Elena had. After a few moments, his face changed. There it is. The pulse wasn't random. It appeared every few seconds, perfectly spaced, like a heartbeat. The vibration returned at 46 minutes, just as before. Only this time Walter didn't look at the engine. He watched the frame beneath it. The steel shifted. Barely. Less than a millimeter. Most people would never have seen it. Walter did. There. He pointed calmly. Shut it down. Nobody spoke for several moments. Walter knelt beside one support bracket. Using a flashlight, he inspected an area coated with old paint and years of grime. Then he scraped gently with a pocket knife. A hairline crack appeared beneath the surface. Tyler stared. We checked those mounts. Walter nodded. You checked for broken bolts. Tyler looked again. This isn't a bolt. No. What is it? Walter traced the crack with one finger. A frame that's been moving. Back inside the office, engineering drawings covered the conference table. Elena compared measurements. Nothing made sense. The mounting points are still within factory tolerance. Walter quietly shook his head. Cold measurements. She looked at him. The problem only appears hot. He nodded. Steel grows. She frowned. Not enough. Usually. This engine has spent 30 years heating and cooling. He slid a pencil across the drawing. Small movements. Another line. Thousands of times. Another. They add up. Elena stared at the sketch. Slowly, the pieces began fitting together. The engine itself wasn't failing. The frame supporting it was allowing microscopic movement once everything expanded under operating temperature. Every sensor had been reporting healthy values because the problem wasn't inside the engine at all. It was beneath it. Tyler leaned back in his chair. We never even thought to test the frame. Walter smiled faintly. You were listening to the computer. What were you listening to? Walter looked toward the workshop. The complaint. Later that afternoon, while waiting for replacement measurements, Elena noticed Walter sitting alone near his toolbox. One notebook rested open on his knees. The pages were covered with tiny handwritten notes. Dates, temperatures, sketches, bearing clearances, fuel qualities, even weather conditions. She sat beside him. You wrote all these? Walter nodded. Most. Why? He smiled thoughtfully. Because memory gets proud. She laughed softly. What does that mean? It starts believing it can't forget. He closed the notebook gently. So I never trusted mine. She turned another page. One entry caught her attention. Flood Relief Station, October 1989. Beside it was a sketch. The frame crack, the thermal expansion, even the same vibration pattern. This, she whispered, it's almost identical. Walter looked at the page for a long moment. I was hoping I was wrong. You've seen this before. Once. What happened? He stared across the workshop instead of answering immediately. We fixed it. He paused. 3 months later, the station was replaced. And no one kept the notes. Silence settled between them. Finally, Elena asked the question she'd been wondering since yesterday. Were you ever an engineer? Walter smiled. No. Then how did you learn all this? He looked down at his weathered hands. Machines. She waited. They're patient teachers. As the afternoon light stretched through the open workshop doors, Walter unlocked the bottom compartment of his toolbox. It stuck slightly before opening. Inside, beneath folded cloth and carefully wrapped gauges, lay a machined steel spacer, unlike anything else in the box. Its edges were clean despite its age. Elena picked it up carefully. What is this? Walter's expression softened with distant memory. I made it 30 years ago. For that repair? He nodded. The job was canceled before we installed it. She looked from the spacer to the cracked engine frame. Slowly, realization spread across her face. It fits. Walter nodded once. If the measurements haven't changed. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the fields. Because for the first time since the broken generator had arrived, they weren't chasing another theory. They were holding a possible answer in their hands. If you'd like, I can also write Chapter 3, 1,000 words, to complete the story with a grounded, emotionally satisfying ending. Morning sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days, spilling long bands of gold across the workshop floor. The rain had washed the dust from the yard outside, and every puddle reflected the faded blue siding of Mason Industrial Repair. It should have felt like an ordinary day. Inside the shop, it didn't. The machined steel spacer lay on a clean white shop towel in the center of the workbench. It wasn't impressive to look at. No polished finish, no company logo. Just a carefully measured piece of steel that had waited more than 30 years for a purpose. Around it stood Elena, Tyler, the shop manager Frank, and Walter. Frank folded his arms. So this is the plan? Walter nodded. If the measurements still match. Frank looked uneasy. And if they don't? Then we don't install it. No one argued. The decision wasn't about pride anymore. It was about getting it right. The next 2 hours passed with almost surgical precision. The generator was lifted just enough to relieve pressure from the damaged mounting frame. Dial indicators were attached. Straight edges stretched across the support rails. Tyler carefully recorded every measurement, while Elena checked each figure independently. Walter never rushed them. Whenever someone announced a number, he simply said, "Check it again." Not because he doubted them, because important work deserved patience. Finally, Elena laid down her caliper. They match. Walter looked at her. You certain? She compared her notebook one last time. Within 0.02 of a millimeter. A small smile appeared beneath Walter's gray mustache. Then that old piece of steel finally gets to do its job. Installation took less than 20 minutes. Waiting took much longer. Everyone stepped back as Tyler prepared the first startup. His hand rested on the control switch. He looked toward Walter. You want to do it? Walter shook his head. No. You found the problem. Walter smiled. You fixed it. Tyler hesitated before pressing the starter. The electric motor engaged. The massive diesel turned once, twice. A cloud of gray exhaust drifted from the stack. Then all 12 cylinders settled into a deep, even idle. No one celebrated. Not yet. The real test had never been startup. It was time. 10 minutes passed. Oil pressure remained steady. 20 minutes. Coolant temperature climbed exactly as expected. 35. The familiar anticipation settled over the workshop. Nobody said much. Even the ordinary shock noises seemed quieter. At 43 minutes, Tyler unconsciously glanced toward the frame. 44. 45. Elena placed 2 fingers lightly against the mounting bracket, where Walter had shown her the strange pulse the day before. Nothing. She frowned, not because something was wrong, because nothing was. 46 minutes arrived, the moment the vibration had always begun. The engine continued humming with calm confidence. No shudder, no rattle, no warning. Only the steady rhythm of thousands of perfectly timed explosions, hidden beneath steel covers. Walter closed his eyes. He wasn't listening for success. He was listening for complaints. There weren't any. An hour later, the generator was connected to a full load test. Outside, electrical equipment hummed as technicians gradually increased demand. Inside, every gauge remained stable. Frank checked them again, then again. Finally, he let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I think. He stopped, then smiled. I think we've got it. Nobody cheered. Instead, Tyler laughed quietly to himself. The kind of laugh that comes after days of carrying tension you didn't know had become so heavy. Elena walked over to Walter. You knew. Walter shook his head. No. You seemed pretty confident. I hoped. That's different. It always is. Word spread faster than anyone expected. By afternoon, operators from the pumping station arrived to inspect the repair. They weren't interested in speeches. They wanted to hear the engine. One by one, they stood beside the generator, listening. One older operator smiled. I haven't heard it run this smooth in years. Walter remained in the background, hands in his pockets, watching everyone else inspect the machine. He never stepped forward to claim credit. Frank eventually noticed. He walked over. People should know you solved this. Walter looked across the workshop. We solved it. You don't have to be modest. I'm not. He nodded toward Tyler and Elena. I couldn't have lifted that engine alone. Frank opened his mouth to argue, then quietly closed it. Walter wasn't avoiding praise. He genuinely meant what he said. Near the end of the day, Elena found Walter cleaning his screwdrivers before placing them back into the toolbox. Each tool returned to the exact place it had occupied for decades. You always pack them like that? Walter smiled. If you spend enough nights fixing engines beside highways, he clicked the final latch closed. You learn not to waste time looking for things. She nodded, then hesitated. I've been thinking. Walter waited. Those notebooks. He looked at the toolbox. What about them? They shouldn't stay closed. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly reopened the lid. Carefully, he lifted the stack of grease-stained notebooks. Some pages had yellowed with age. Others carried fingerprints permanently pressed into the paper. He ran one hand gently across the top cover. They're only notes. Elena shook her head. No. They're experience. Walter looked down. I always thought I'd organize them someday. They don't need organizing. They're messy. So are real repairs. He laughed softly. She continued. Would you leave them here? Walter looked surprised. Here? So the next mechanic who gets stuck has another place to start. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Walter handed her the notebooks. One by one, as though each carried more weight than paper should. Take care of them. I will. No. He smiled gently. Use them. Autumn arrived. The generator continued running without issue. The repair yard, once expected to close, had secured new maintenance contracts thanks to the successful repair and the confidence it restored among local customers. Near Elena's office, a simple wooden shelf had appeared. It held no trophies, no awards, only a row of grease-marked notebooks. Some belonged to Walter. Others were new. Tyler had started writing after every unusual repair. Soon everyone else followed. Not because anyone ordered them to, because they discovered something valuable in slowing down long enough to record what a machine had tried to teach them. One crisp October afternoon, Walter returned for a visit. He carried the same old toolbox. It felt noticeably lighter now. Missing anything? Walter smiled. Only paper. They walked through the workshop together. Young apprentices gathered around an engine, debating an unusual vibration. One reached automatically toward a diagnostic tablet. Another stopped him. Hang on. He walked over to the shelf, pulled down one of the notebooks, and began reading. Walter watched from across the room without saying a word. His eyes settled on the shelf for only a moment before he quietly turned toward the door. Outside, the air smelled of harvested fields and cooling earth. He paused beside his old pickup truck and looked back once. Through the open workshop doors came the familiar sounds of honest work. Wrenches turning, engines idling, laughter between mechanics, pages flipping inside grease-stained notebooks. The toolbox in his hand still held tools, but its greatest contents had already been passed on. Walter climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove slowly down the gravel road. Behind him, the repaired generator continued its steady hum, powering water pumps that farmers would never think twice about. They would never know the name of the man whose patience had kept those pumps running, and Walter was perfectly content with that. Some legacies are carved into stone, others are written in oil stains, worn notebook pages, and the quiet habit of listening before trying to fix what seems broken. Those are the ones that keep working long after the hands that created them have finally come to rest. If read aloud at a natural storytelling pace, the complete 3-chapter script is approximately 15 to 18 minutes, making it well suited for a high-retention cinematic YouTube video.